Welcome back, everyone. My name is Scott Korb. I'm the director of the first year writing program at Eugene Lang College, and I am very pleased to be welcoming today Miller Oberman, a colleague of mine at Lang, and Ellen Bass, the author of the new book, Indigo. And I'm very pleased for our last craft lesson lunch of the season to turn it over to them to have a discussion of Indigo. And I am very eager to hear. So welcome, Miller. Welcome, Ellen. I'll duck out and take it away.
Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Scott.
I think that Ellen is going to read some poems for us, and then we will talk about some of them.
That sounds great. I'm going to read some poems from my new book, Indigo. And this first one is called Bringing Flowers to Salinas Valley State Prison. I started a poetry workshop about maybe almost 10 years ago now at Salinas Valley State Prison, which is what the new name is. It used to be called Soledad. And this poem arose out of teaching there. Bringing Flowers to Salinas Valley State Prison. When Mr. H saw the little meadow blooming on the steel table, he bowed to the starry faces of jasmine. This is the first flower I've smelled in 20 years. And when I slid each man a bouquet in a paper cup, Mr. M said, "I'll have such a short time with these." We spoke then about beauty and loss, the great themes of poetry. And when our time was done, and the guard said they'd have to leave the flowers, most of the men acquiesced. But Mr. S insisted he had, as a Native American, a right to his rituals: sage, sweet corn, tobacco, and no one could stop him. It was the law from taking these sacred plants back to his cell. Then he raised his cup and drank the water the flowers were drinking, and a small wind stirred in that windowless room as we watched Mr. S quietly bite the heads off the Peruvian lilies, crushing their pink sepals and the gold inner petals flecked with maroon, swallowing the silvery filaments, their dark pollen-laden anthers, his mouth frothing with blossoms. When I showed that poem to Mr. S, he was very pleased to have that experience recorded. And there's something about seeing oneself reflected in a poem, not necessarily a poem that's written about you the way this one was, but your experience reflected, that I think allows you to know your experience more deeply. He hadn't realized how successful he had been, how he had accomplished what he set out to do. He hadn't quite self-reflected on it until seeing the poem. And then he was really proud of himself, as I was. This next poem is called Experiment in Empathy. And maybe it's a good poem for these days when we need so much of that. Experiment in Empathy. The scientist places each rat in its own glass box, and for 30 seconds he plays What a Wonderful World. In the last 3 seconds, he shocks the rat. This is followed by 90 beats of silence, and then the cycle begins again. As she describes it to me, I can't help thinking how familiar this is. 1 minute, Louis Armstrong singing, and the next, some fever or wreck, some impossible mistake. And I sit holding a spoon, unable to lift it to my mouth, unable to put it down. This strain of rats descends from a circus in the 1800s. Their ancestors swung on satin-ribboned trapezes and leaped through tiny rings of fire. Now, none of those skills can save them. And here's the thing. A rat who isn't shocked, who only watches panics too. That is empathy, feeling what another creature feels. But sometimes it's too much to ask a person to inhabit the strange region of a foreign heart. Once, when I was in a glut of pain, I said to a friend, "Just take an hour and imagine this is happening to you." She looked straight ahead and said, "I don't want to." I had a lot of fun writing this next poem. It's called The Kitchen Counter. Today, I heard a young woman read a poem in which her husband lifts her bare bottom onto the kitchen counter and, in the next line, spreads her legs. The marriage has problems. They may already be divorced. But suddenly, I am ruing the fact that no one has lifted my bottom onto a kitchen counter. Not when my bottom trotted high and proud, and not when it began to eye the floor as if contemplating its future. And now I'm going to die without ever being taken on those cold, hard tiles. Don't tell me it's not too late. It is. That's inspired at least one young woman to get up there on that counter, so don't wait too long or it might be too late. The next poem I'm going to read is The Small Country. Unique, I think, is the Scottish tartle, that hesitation when introducing someone whose name you've forgotten. And what could capture cafuné, the Brazilian Portuguese way to say, running your fingers tenderly through someone's hair? Is there a term in any tongue for choosing to be happy? And where is speech for the block of ice we pack in the sawdust of our hearts? What appellation approaches the smell of apricots thickening the air when you boil jam in early summer? What words reach the way I touched you last night, as though I had never known a woman, an explorer, wholly curious to discover each particular fold and hollow, without guide, not even the mirror of my own body. Last night you told me you liked my eyebrows. You said you never really noticed them before. What is the word that fuses this freshness with the pity of having missed it? And how even touch itself cannot mean the same to both of us, even in this small country of our bed, even in this language with only 2 native speakers.
Thank you for reading those. Let's talk a little bit about the small country, and then maybe read a couple of them and talk about those. One of the first, and I think we have a screen grab of my notes on this poem. If they could go up, that would be great, just so people can sort of see the kind of things I was noticing as I was reading, in case that's useful for other people who are scribbling on poems sometimes. So the first thing that I sort of noticed was that, in a good way, the poem really tricks me. I think, this is a poem, this is this great definition poem, right? I'm getting these words, I'm thinking, this is great. There's a word actually for everything, and this poet knows what they are, and they're going to tell me. And then it kind of turns to these, I start to see these interior questions, right, that there are no answers for. And then it sort of turns again. Small country. It sort of turns again. And we follow, as the jam thickens, I felt we go into this intimate space of the bedroom. And we get into this smaller country, and I'm left on the fence at the end of the poem. There is a word for everything, and then there's not. And it creates this amazing tension as I read. And one of the things that I really noticed, which I think if people are seeing my notes, they'll see there's these little numbers running down the side. And I was noticing that the stanzas at first start really small, these 2-line stanzas and these 1-line stanzas, and then they get thicker sort of with the jam, is what it seemed to me. So that was one question that I had for you about it is, how did you pay attention to the form, the thickness of the lines and the stanzas as you were revising?
Well, it seemed like this is a very simplistic answer, but it seemed like, the 2 lines talked about the Scottish turtle and then 2 that talked about Cafuné. And I guess you could say that those could have been one stanza because they're both talking about words that are untranslatable. But they seem to me to want a little bit more breathing room and a little more individuality, a little more spotlight on each one. Mm-hmm. And then the next 2 are 1-line stanzas, and each one again felt to me like it was a big idea. It was for me that there was a whole world behind. Is there a term in any tongue for choosing to be happy? In my life, there's just years of world behind that. So it didn't want to be squished up against. This is very technical and very intellectual kind of answer to this question, but that's how I think about it. That these needed room, and then of course the 2 jam lines are together in one stanza, and then we start to, maybe it's kind of relaxed. Maybe there's a kind of relaxation into, okay, now I'm going to tell you a story. And it's a question here, what words reach the way I touched you last night, but there's no question mark. And I did think about that. So it's a kind of a question, but it's not really a question. It's just saying, there are no words for it. And so all of that whole sentence is its own stanza. And then this part, I love this part about the eyebrows.
It's so good.
I should say here that my wife and I have been together for 38 years and were good friends for 9 before then. So, for her to just now notice my eyebrows is something that you might, take a moment. This isn't like, 6 months in and somebody says, wow, never really looked at your eyebrows before. So it was just, one of those kind of charming experiences. And
yeah, it's even funnier than I knew when I found it funny the first time.
Yeah. And then that again, I didn't think I wanted to make a stanza break between what is the word that fuses this expression, because that's all one thought really. And then the last 3 lines are again, that whole sentence and thought.
Yeah, it's really. I love how the poem thickens as it gets intimate that way, and it reminded me, maybe because I was thinking a little bit about our conversation last week about translation. It reminded me of this thing, and I'm going to probably sort of misquote her, but that Gayatri Spivak said about translation in her essay Politics and Translation. And she says something like, how do I know when I'm ready to translate this language? Would I use it within intimate bonds?
Oh, that's beautiful.
It's so beautiful. And she essentially says, like, well, would you speak this language in bed? And if you would, then have at it. And it feels like that's what this poem does.
Oh, that's quite wonderful. I didn't know that. I love thinking of this poem in relationship to that.
Because it really is like about translation of feeling and experience. Is there a word for this?
Yes. And this way in which I mean, I think ultimately, for me, the understanding, because every poem, if it's a really successful poem for me writing it, I learn something. I see the world differently. I see my life, my experience differently. And something changes within me. Something is discovered or transformed. And I think what I came to here is a real opening of my understanding that it really is, no matter how close I am to somebody else, that we can't, even in the most intimate of situations, uh, like a marriage and like in bed in a marriage and like such a long marriage, we're still not going to have the same experience.
Yeah.
Not exactly.
Not
And I came to an acceptance of that, that I think I didn't have, that I know I didn't quite have before I wrote the poem.
Yeah. People who are looking at my notes might see in that that first thicker stanza, the 5-line stanza, I have this note that says like holy, and then this little arrow to hollow, and then I just like made some exclamation marks because I was following the sound in that stanza, and I loved that movement from holy to hollow. And then I was thinking about the sort of connection between those two words. They're connected through sound, I noticed first, but then I really started to think about what's the connection between something being whole and something being hollow. And then I realized that the word holy, the way you have it spelled there, comes from the same Old English root as the word holy, Holy, right? The Old English word is halig, Halig. And
I love knowing that.
Yeah, it made it more beautiful to me. But it also, I felt like it encompasses that meaning. You can see how those two words come from the same place. And I just love this hollow, which is not really a lack, but is a place for something. And so the wholeness goes into that place. It's so beautiful. I don't have a question.
Thank you. Thank you.
I mean, I guess if I had a question, it would be how much attention are you paying to sound as you revise something like that?
A lot. A lot. Especially in this poem. I remember really having a wonderful time paying attention to sound with the apricot section, and getting all those wonderful A sounds in there and the L sounds, because it's such a luscious experience, that smell.
Yeah. The other question, I think this is the last question I'll ask you about this poem because I want to move on to photograph, but Ellen sent me very generously, a bunch of drafts of this poem that I think you had compiled for students to show them. And one of the things that you said was that you were so lucky because you had all of these notes, and really the whole poem was in those notes, and you just had to kind of shave away at it. There's pages and pages of notes, and one of the questions that I had reading them was like, how did you decide what to cut in some places? Because there's these beautiful lines that you lose, and like also beautiful words that you lose. The Yiddish one I loved, Angapachka, which you wrote Angapachka, which even Jews can't agree on how to spell, which is a kind of fordomeness. Which is so great. And then another line I really loved is, or for apples when they are still tight on the tree. I loved the sound of that. And I thought just the word tight was so perfect there for how apples can be on a tree. And it was sort of Frostian. And so I wondered, especially for younger poets who might be listening and watching, like, how do you decide how to trim that much? And what to take away?
I'm glad that you reminded me of those apples tight on the tree. Maybe I can use them in another poem. This was a hard one because I was in love with so many of these words. And I was just looking up words and thinking of words from my own life. We use Angapatska a lot in my family. And, so words that I didn't know before, words that I did know before. But I knew that this poem didn't want to be top heavy in that way. And so over a period of time, I just kept eliminating ones until I, got to the two that were the winners, essentially. They got to stay in. And I was just really strict with myself and said, you can have two. That's all you can have. Mm-hmm. And the other hard part with this is that I had all the parts, but I didn't know how they went. And there was an ending. I don't know if you had a chance to kind of look through all of it, but there was this ending that was about driving past lemon trees in blossom, and that you can only get a kind of, whiff of that smell. And I just thought that was the most marvelous ending for weeks until I realized that I was just going overboard. I was just kind of going past. I had done it, but the ending, these last two lines of the last three stanzas of, what words reach the way I touched you, and the eyebrows, and even touch cannot mean the same to us. They were embedded in the mess of the poem. They wasn't like I had gotten to the end and went, okay, that's the end, which sometimes happens, but not in this one. This was one where I had to have a high tolerance for messiness and to just slowly whittle away bit by bit until the poem kind of emerged out of that mess. That's, again, not very technical, but I think that is how we work. We're sort of we're sort of feeling our way in the dark, and you do a little, and you take a look, and you read it a bunch, and you wait, and you read it some more, and you take a little more off. And sometimes for me, a poem will sit around for a while with, the kitchen table, for example, that I read was probably 3 times as long. And, after you say, don't tell me it's not too late, it is, there's really nothing to say. But I kept feeling like I had to say something more. And so I went on and I went on and I went on. And I kept being dissatisfied with everything after that until, finally it became apparent that, no, that's it. There's no more to say. Because it got boring after that. That's one thing that I think helps you know what to leave in and what to take out is when you're a little bored with parts of your poem, the chances are good that they should go out.
That is great advice. Will you read Photograph?
Yes.
For us?
Yeah, this is a poem that I wrote for a project called New Voices. I think it's something like Contemporary Writers Confront the Holocaust, that we were given an image. We were each who participated in this project were given an image and asked to write in response to it. And we didn't get to pick the image. So I was very fortunate because the image that I was given actually did resonate for me. And so, but I didn't know how to approach this poem. And so I thought that I would just try to approach with description and questioning. And this is called Photograph, Jews Probably Arriving to the Woods Ghetto, circa 1941 to 1942. And that's the title of the photograph that I was given. Why is a horse here alongside the train? 2 horses, yoked with leather harnesses, light silvering their flanks in the midst of the Jews descending. Where is the driver taking the cart, loaded with wooden planks? What is in the satchel that weighs down the arm of a woman in a dark coat, her hair parted on one side? A woman I could mistake for my mother in the family album, only my mother was in Philadelphia selling milk and eggs and penny candy because her mother escaped the pogroms, a small girl in steerage crying for her mother. What are the tight knots of people saying to one another? A star burns the right shoulder blade of each man, each woman. Light strikes each shorn neck and caps each skull. No one is yet stripped of all but a pail or a tin to drink from and piss in. Dread, like sun, sears the air and breaks over the plains of their faces. Light clatters down upon them like stones, but we can't hear it. Nor can we hear blood thud under their ribs. They will be led into the ghetto and then will be led out to the camps. But for now, the eternal now, the light is silent. Silent the shadows in the folds of their coats. The bones of the horses are almost visible. Their nostrils are deep, soft shadows. And the woman, who could be but is not my mother, still carries her canvas bag and, looking closer, what might be a small purse.
Thank you for reading that. I was so surprised at how much the poem moved me when I read it for the first time. I think just because sometimes it feels like with something, I want to say something like the Holocaust, but there's nothing like that exactly. But when we're reading about a tragedy that is so well documented, and we've experienced so many images and films and information about it already, it can be hard to have what feels like a original emotional response to it. And somehow I did to this poem. I was so moved by it. And so then I was trying to figure out, like, how did she do this? How is this so beautifully moving? And I think one thing I think is because of how small you stay in the poem. And I was thinking of something you said last week about telling your students that you don't have to stay in one place in a poem. You can like broaden the frame and zoom in, and you do that. You move around the photograph that way. Just when I think I start to get comfortable, you move, the poem moves. And I think you're doing something in this poem that I'm starting to think might be, I'm still trying to figure out exactly how to say this right, but might be something that you do better than I've ever seen anyone else do it, which is that you find ways in a poem to make me as a reader stay in it longer than I would, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's the really big challenge, I think, of a poem is keeping the reader with you, because the reader has so many other things to do. You know, I mean, the reader doesn't need to stay in your poem. The reader can go and, you know, eat an avocado or surf or, you know, read another poem or another book. I mean, the reader can do anything, right? You know, the reader can play with their baby. And, you know, why would the reader want to stay in your poem? They have to be with you every moment.
But especially, why would they want to stay in your poem when there's something truly unbearable in it?
Yeah.
Right. And I think in this poem, one of the things that I noticed is the way that light moves through. And that seems to me to be the kind of through line here. I wrote down light silvers, light burns, light strikes, clatters, and then finally is silent. You can just keep moving through it, and it by the time it's clattering, that is so, it almost feels painful. It feels physically harsh and painful because of the kind of, I guess, synesthesia there. I wouldn't normally expect light to make a sound. And of course, a photo is silent. But the way that was one of the things I think that really kept me in the poem, was the way that the light moved through. Was that something you were thinking about?
Yes, I was thinking about it. And I think because it's a photograph, and because in this photograph, the light is really apparent the way it is, there's dark and light. It was kind of offered up to me to use it that way. I think that I wanted to make, I was, the part that I was very conscious of is the way the beauty and the horror could exist together. And so I wanted to show the beautiful part of the light, but also we couldn't ever forget that this is a scene of great disaster and suffering. So that tension was there, the beautiful and the terrible.
Yeah, and I think that tension, one of the places, I think it's so perfect that the poem is in couplets for that reason. Those couplets hold that tension of those two things happening at once all the time.
Mm-hmm.
They feel sort of bony, like the horse, maybe. And I think some of the line breaks here really do so much work to show that tension. I think one of the things that my students often struggle with, no matter what their writing is, who gets to tell what story, who gets to speak and for whom and when, and who gets to identify with what. And it seems to me that this poem beautifully addresses that for itself. Maybe not an answer for everyone, but I'm looking at the line breaks at the very end, and the woman who could be but is not, stanza break. My mother still carries her canvas bag. And because of the way you broke those lines and those stanzas there, my mother still carries her canvas bag, right? Like it is and isn't the mother. The speaker of the poem is completely clear. I realize this is not my mother. This is someone else's mother. But at the same time, there's this felt tension between those things that is in the sort of bones, the craft of the poem.
I think that concern about who gets to tell your story and who gets to tell other stories is a really important one that culturally we're recognizing maybe more than ever before. And the challenge for me when I do try and write about something that is a larger world concern is, what is my relationship to it? And that can that be a way to enter it? And here, of course, it's through the woman and my mother, and the my own family history that is not absolutely directly connected to this picture, but is absolutely connected to the picture because it would have been so easy for my grandmother and my mother to be in Europe at that time had they not come into the United States earlier. So I was able to go back through this lineage of mothers, and then there was that uncanniness that there, and in the picture, the people are pretty small. So I could see them and I could see their faces, but I couldn't see them in the way that, if they were very large, maybe it wouldn't remind me so much of my mother. But in the way that they were, and their coats and that era, I know my mother from not long after that time. I was born in 1947. So I have pictures in our family album from that time of my mother and my grandmother and my aunts and uncles. And so that came in very naturally, but it came in naturally, but it came in also because I'm always on the lookout for that. If I'm writing about something that's a larger concern, I'm always trying to be aware of what is my relationship to this.
Yeah. And I think that comes through so clearly and sort of honestly in the poem. And that's why it works so well to end on that bag, I think.
Well, it's very interesting because I didn't realize it quite consciously when I was writing it, but afterward, my mother was obsessed with her pocketbook. And we, in our family, we'd say pocketbook, which I get totally teased about by my family, pocketbook. But that's how we said it, in New Jersey. And my mother's pocketbook or purse was like always put in the same place. She had a recurring dream of losing it. And so it was one of these items in my growing up that was iconic. And I didn't realize it when I was writing the poem, and even for a while afterward. I just knew that small purse really was got me, and it seemed like I didn't have an explanation for why it got me, but I knew that it was right and kind of quirky there at the end. And then I realized, oh yeah, because my mother's relationship to her purse was so powerful, intense.
Yeah. And again, like the way that you're moving between, like a careful reader, like you're reading the poem, you understand which purse is which, but the way that you're moving around syntactically, you get both at the same time. And I think that's something poetry can do. I think that's something special that poetry can do, to have hold both of those things at once while you're reading. While you know one thing and not another, you get both. Yeah, and this poem really does that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Will you read Indigo for us? Because I don't want to have time to talk about that.
I'd be happy to read it. This is the title poem of the book, Indigo. As I'm walking on West Cliff Drive, a man runs toward me, pushing one of those jogging strollers with shock absorbers, so the baby can keep sleeping, which this baby is. I can just get a glimpse of its almost translucent eyelids. The father is young, a jungle of indigo and carnelian, tattooed from knuckle to jaw, leafy vines and blossoms, saints and symbols. Thick wooden plugs pierce his lobes, and his sunglasses testify to the radiance haloed around him. I'm so jealous, as I often am. It's a kind of obsession. I want him to have been my child's father. I want to have married a man who wanted to be in a body, who wanted to live in it so much that he marked it up like a book, underlining, highlighting, writing in the margins, I was here. Not like my dead ex-husband, who was always fighting against the flesh, who sat for hours on his zafu chanting Om, and then went out and broke his hand punching the car. I imagine when this galloping man gets home, he's going to want to have sex with his wife, who slept in late, and then he'll eat barbecued ribs and let the baby teethe on a bone while he drinks a dark beer. I can't stop wishing my daughter had had a father like that. I can't stop wishing I'd had that life. Oh, I know, it's a miracle to have a life, any life at all. It took 8 years for my parents to conceive me. First there was the war, and then just waiting. And my mother's bones so narrow, she had to be slit and I airlifted. That anyone is born, each precarious success, from sperm and egg to zygote, embryo, infant, is a wonder. And here I am, alive, almost 70 years, and nothing has killed me. Not the car I totaled running a stop sign, or the spirochete that screwed into my blood. Not the tree that fell in the forest exactly where I was standing, my best friend shoving me backward so I fell on my ass as it crashed. I'm alive, and I gave birth to a child. So she didn't get a father who'd sling her onto his shoulder, and so much else she didn't get. I've cried most of my life over that. And now there's everything that we can't talk about. We love, but cannot take too much of each other. Yet she is the one who, when I asked her to kill me if I no longer had my mind, we were on our way into Ross shopping for dresses. That's something she likes, and they all look adorable on her. She's the only one who didn't hesitate or refuse or waver or flinch. As we strode across the parking lot, she said, "Okay, but when's the cutoff? That's what I need to know."
Thank you for reading that. This poem is so amazing to me, where it gets, and I'm so not expecting that. And so then, like, when I read it a second time and a third time, the second time it's like everything's hitting differently, right? Because I know where I'm going a little bit, and so it feels like this big surprise. But I was already surprised the first time because of this guy who, like, I sort of hate. Like, to me, I'm like, oh, that guy, right? And because that's one of the things reading the poem is that this guy doesn't exist, right? Like, we don't know. The guy is completely fabricated. His physical form exists, right? The speaker is seeing the physical form, but all of these other attributes, like the baby teething on the bone, like, just cracks me up. Like, all of these other attributes are just invented by the poem and by the speaker, like, as a means to think through something and to feel through something and to get somewhere. And it's so surprising where it gets and how it gets there. And I think that, like, for this poem, one of the things that keeps me so in it is the sort of variation of the high and low diction and description. And like, that's where the surprise sort of, I started to notice how it was doing it, how we're starting with this tattooed guy, and how we get to this conversation. Because on one hand, there's just like this jogging guy and lines like, "I fell on my ass." But then we have things like 3 lines before "I fell on my ass," we have this spirochete that screwed into my blood, which is so lyrical and beautiful. Like, I had to look up what a spirochete was, but it's a bacteria that is in the shape of a corkscrew. And so, of course, then you have this perfect verb there. But the proximity of those to each other, the spirochete and the "fell on my ass," the poem just keeps you off balance and you never know which thing it's going to be, which feels very much kind of like life, where you don't ever know what you're going to get. This transcendent conversation in the Ross parking lot.
Yes, can you think of a better place?
No, so brilliant that it's Ross. That was so perfect. There's a question in there somewhere. Yeah, I maybe just starting with that appreciation. But I guess here's a question. One of the things I noticed, and in all three of the poems that we've talked about, the form that you're using, the way they visually look on the page, each one is so different. Whether it's like these thin stanzas that thicken with a jam, or these couplets in the photograph, and then this poem just goes right down the page without any break at all. And I found by the time I got to the end reading it that I was kind of breathless, that the poem felt like this jog with the stroller maybe, that left me out of breath. And so by the time we get to the end, I almost didn't have breath to take away with this shocking, question. And so I guess my first question is how much were you thinking about that?
Yes, this poem, I didn't have to think about that too much in this poem, because it really seemed like it was a rolling forward that was unstoppable. Each part wanted to roll forward into the next part, and it didn't want to be orderly and have stanzas and because there wasn't a chance to stop anywhere. It kind of like in life, and yes, the high diction and the low diction and the feeling, some of it is funny and some of it is about lifelong sorrow and regret, and some of it is redemption, and some of it is tensions and miseries and joys, and it's just all because it shifts feeling so much too. You couldn't say, okay, well, here's the happy part, here's the sad part. So I think in that way it had to all just be together.
There's nowhere to stop. Yeah.
No, you don't get to stop. And I never thought about it in terms of the man jogging, but that's kind of wonderful, that not being able to stop, as though he does not stop too. He keeps jogging forever now.
Because I think the poem is so much about the body, right? And we start off with this description of the body, of this man's body, and then this like response to it, and then the comparison of him and the ex-husband, right? Who sounds even certainly much worse than the tattooed guy, like, and people's attempts to be in their body. But of course, then we end the poem with the speaker's desire to not be in the body anymore, once it doesn't have the mind.
Right.
And so it amazingly just takes us, it's like body, 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 body. But then it's like, no, that's not what's important at the end of it.
Right. Yeah. And something that I didn't notice, but my son pointed out when he read it, is it begins with a baby and it ends with death. Mm-hmm. I had no idea I did that. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you're doing things and you just don't know what you're doing.
Yeah.
Until after you've done them.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think this poem, sort of like the photograph poem too, it keeps me in it. It doesn't hit me all at once with the fear and the anxiety of where it's going, right? The terror of not having control over yourself or your own life, or not being with it, is so frightening. But like, it doesn't start there. I'm not being hit with that. I'm given all of these other things, so that I stay with it to that place. Yeah.
And I had, of course, no idea where this poem was going.
Yeah.
this just rolled out the way that I wrote this poem differently than almost any other poem I've ever written, which is I was indeed walking along West Cliff Drive and saw this man, and immediately I understood this way of looking at the tattoos of wanting to be in a body that much, that you wanted to, really make your mark on it. And I went home and on a little scrap of paper, just wrote out the progression of the poem. Boom, 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 boom. It just was there, but it had been waiting and trying to come through in some way or another, trying to talk about these things for 40, 45 years of failed poems, trying to write about these feelings and this marriage and my daughter and all of this and this obsession, and the man just crystallized it. And then I held on to the piece of paper for some weeks until I had time, a really open, extended period of time where I could find the language to move through that poem. But I don't think I've ever had an outline for a poem before. But that came just it both instantly, and it took 4 or 5 decades.
Yeah, it has that feeling to it, and I think maybe that's why the runner is so perfect as a place to put it, because it was like, if you couldn't find a place to put these feelings, it's this meeting in the poem.
Yes.
Container, like the guy is a container that all of a sudden you're able to pour into in this beautiful way.
That's right. Once I got that metaphor, then everything just came clear. It's sort of the exact opposite process of writing The Small Country, where, I had to write and discover where the poem was going and what should go in and what should go out. And, it's a process of elimination and more generative. And this was just kind of the exact opposite. It was just the kind of progression of it came in a flash. And then I just had to sit down and take a few days to actually find the language.
Yeah. I love this question, the daughter who gets to speak at the end of the poem, because we also ask this question that we don't have an answer to, right? The poem doesn't give us an answer to that question. And so there's a sort of unsettled feeling at the end. I'm getting notes about that we've used a lot of time. If people have questions and they want to jot them down, we'll pause for them in a minute. I wanted to ask you one more thing, which was that when we were first talking about this format, you said something like, it will be so fun to get to actually talk about the poems, as opposed to usually when I'm interviewed and I get all of these biographical type questions. That struck me so much. And I guess one question that it sort of raised for me that might be interesting for students, maybe writers to think about is, how much we were all taught sort of in our earlier educations, perhaps, that like, if you could just ask an author about a poem, that they would tell you what it meant, or if you would just read their biography, you could take what you learned about them and sort of transpose it onto a poem. These methods of reading that are sort of heavy-handed, rather than sort of offering a close reading or questions about craft or how did this thing get made. What is it for you that gets lost when you're just talking about maybe your life rather than the poems themselves.
Yes, that's an interesting thing to talk about, and maybe a great thing to talk about, especially if any of you who are listening sometimes interview writers to think about. I think what gets lost is a chance to talk about what might be more interesting, really. Those of us who love poetry, who love literature, are really excited by, I know I am when I'm listening, really excited by a close reading, excited by what somebody might see in a poem that maybe I've read that poem before, but I didn't see some of what they're able to point out to me because they have a different insight into the poem. And especially, I love to get to hear writers talk about their own poems because they know how the poem got made, and maybe I'm going to learn something. Maybe there's something that I'm going to want to try. And I'm not at all, I'm not, like opposed to talking about my life. I just don't think that, and I don't mean it has no interest, I mean, if we were just sitting around and talking, I might ask you things like where you grew up and, who were your influences and, where you went to school and when did you know you were first going to be a poet. But I don't know that enriches the listener very much or helps them get more deeply into a poem, helps them read other poems more deeply, helps them write their own poems better. And I just don't think it's that interesting.
Yeah.
And it's certainly not interesting for me because I know it all. Whereas here, we're talking about something and, I get to hear how you read the poem and what is interesting to you, which is not the same thing as what would be the most interesting to another person. They might be pointing out something quite different than what you're pointing out. And so it keeps it alive. It keeps it more fresh for me. Whereas like if I say where I went to school and study with Anne Sexton, which indeed was quite wonderful. But, how many times can I say that and still feel, like I'm saying something new?
Yeah.
For
I was
me.
the urge to ask you about Anne Sexton. Feeling you had many times before, but it's just really cool.
It's super cool. And I will say this, although I've said it before, but I think it's a good thing that people know just this one thing is that she was a wonderful teacher. And she was so thoughtful. She was so respectful. And she was so encouraging, not particularly because, and not at all really, because she thought I was such a good poet, which I really was not. And I don't think she saw that I was going to, have any potential that she was excited about supporting, but she was just supportive to all of us and quite wonderful. And I think had I not had her at that point in my life, I don't know if I would have gone on because there was so much discouragement at that point, and she was very encouraging. But she's a wonderful teacher. Mm. And I'm glad that her work. I'm glad that her work is more respected now than it was for a while. You know how things go in and out of vogue, and she had been really out of vogue for a while, and now people are looking and going, I mean, she is just amazing.
Is there something, I know we're basically out of time, but is there something that you think you really learned from her work that you see in your poems?
Yeah, I think that the wildness of her metaphors helped me accept my own wild mind. I think my strength as a poet is in a kind of natural orientation toward thinking metaphorically. And she is so wild and amazing in her metaphors. And also, of course, she, as well as another other handful of writers, Lucille Clifton and Sylvia Plath and Muriel Werkeiser, were writing about women's experience, and especially I'm thinking about writing about the body and sexuality in ways that were very bold at the time and made a path for all of us who followed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was gonna say the freedom and the sexuality in your poems too, I think is very sort of Sextonian. That's not a word, I don't think, but it really reminded me of her, how fierce she is on the page, to not give that up.
Yes.
And I see that in your poems too. Yeah.
Thank you.
We have any questions, but I don't think we do. Apparently we have comments. We can't see them. But we are out of time. So, although I think I'm going to try to get Ellen to just do this with me every week. So,
yeah, that'd be so much fun, Miller.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful. And thanks everybody for listening in.
Thank you for all coming, and especially thank you to Scott Korb, who put together the Lang Craft Lesson Lunch series, which has been such a wonderful thing for our students and faculty to attend in person and now over Zoom. So thank you all for coming.
Bye-bye.